Good morning, everyone. Good morning. Hello out there. Good
Good
morning. Good
morning.
morning. Great to see all of your faces popping up on this cool Sunday morning in Maine, wherever you are. It's a cool fall day here in Portland. Feel free to jump in the chat and say where you're tuning in from if you like. Um, on behalf of Maine Writers and Publishers Alliance, really happy to, as well as the Maine Arts Commission and Julia Bausma's Maine Poet Laureate Julia Bausma's Write Me program, really happy to kick off our first online workshop with Richard Blanco. Um, and I don't think there's much else I need to say, so I'm just going to hand it to Richard and let you all get into the fun stuff. So thank you for Richard for doing this.
All right. Good morning, everyone else. Volume okay? We can hear
That's
me.
great.
Great. All right, great. Wonderful to be with all of you here. Wonderful to see some very familiar faces. So what I plan to do today is to go over briefly a couple of sort of really essential craft techniques or craft tools for the benefit of those that might be newer to writing poetry. And for those of you who are not, who are more seasoned writers, and of course I recognize several in the room and in the Zoom room, I guess it'll serve as a refresher in some ways, which never hurts. I'm going to share my screen, and then we'll take after we do that, and then we're going to start diving into letter poems, and then I'll share with you some thoughts on what is an epistolary poem, what is a letter poem, what makes a poem, a letter poem, etc. And then towards the last half or last third of the workshop, we'll do some startup exercises to get you going on potential ideas and poems, letter poems to follow up on your own. All right, let me share my screen. And this with apologies to those that have been in my workshops that I've seen this graphic many, many times. But again, I think it's such an important tool for all of us to be reminded of, or for those of us that are newer to poetry. Let me just make sure I zoom here. So I just wanted to sort of talk a little bit more deeply about what that golden rule of show, don't tell is, right? We've probably all heard that before. And if you haven't heard that before, like I said, we'll take a little bit of a deeper dive into it. All I want to say is, I'll begin by saying that essentially, when we pause and really think about it, right, we are biological human beings, and everything that becomes an abstract thought in our head is at some point one of five sensory details or sensory information, which is our five senses: what we smell, touch, hear, taste, etc. And we when as a toddler, right, you pick up or a toddler will pick up a toy and immediately will stick it in their mouth, throw it, stick it in their nose, stick it in their ear, smell it, squeeze it, right? They're trying to learn everything about this object through the senses. And we get really good at doing that really fast, right? Like we can take a sensory experience or a sensory detail and in picoseconds, like immediately make an abstract thought about it. Um, so why is that important? Well, the reader at the end of a poem, right, is also a human being, right? And unless there are poets or readers who have a sixth sense, ESP, and that's another workshop that I'm not qualified to teach, um, they are experiencing the world through the five senses. So what's important about show, don't tell is the idea that we try to use sensory details through the poem as a way of bridging the experience of the poet with to the reader. So sensory details are the language of experience. And that is able, as this is what this little graphic is sort of showing, is able to recreate that world for the reader, that experience through all the sights, smells, touches, and tastes that we, as the writer, as the poet, have experienced. Now, that's not all that's going on in a poem, but it's a very essential part, right? I'll give you a couple of analogies that I think will help to sort of bring that home a little bit more. Right when we see, you can listen, you can hear, you can sort of read the lyrics to a song, right? But why do we still go to concerts? Right? Because it's all the senses are involved, right? The smells, the sound, the lights, etc. The stale smell of beer, of pot, etc. We have an experience that's different and multisensory. When we go see a movie, right? We're not if you were going if you went to a movie theater or downloaded something or streaming something and it just said, this is a beautiful love story that ends in tragedy because the families of these two young people are hate each other and etc., like you were told what the movie was about, right? But you didn't experience it. You didn't experience the 2 hours that it takes to make a movie, right? And you didn't experience the gestures of the lovers' faces, the swirl of the hair, the sound of their voices, etc. We are fundamentally understand the world and experience the world through sensory information. Um, um, Again, we get really abstract at that, and I mean, we get really quick at turning something abstract from a sensory detail. Ever meet somebody and in a split second you make a judgment, right? Oh, I really like that person, or God, what a pain in the ass. Or you don't really understand that we're not fully aware or not aware at all, really, that we're just translating sensory information and making abstract conclusions about that. That person might have just had a nice color eyes, or their gestures, and they had a really nice smile, or they smelled nice, or that person might have had a bad day and had a grumpy frown on their face, and is not looking at you directly in the eye. We are constantly absorbing information from the world through those senses, and that becomes important again in a poem because in a way we're translating experience, right? Whether that experience is having a big family dinner or contemplating a tree, the beauty of a tree, whatever that may be, sensory details, as we see in this little graphic, is the bridge between the reader and the poet. It's an essential bridge that connects us. And I think it happens not only in poetry, it happens in all art, right? When we respond to a painting, what are we responding to? We're responding to the colors, right? To the textures of the painting, to the vibrancy of those colors, to all sorts of the size of the painting, right? And like that, et cetera, you can realize that we are poetry is not the only art that's exclusive to the show don't tell kind of idea. There's something else that I find interesting as well. So when I put a little bubble around the reader's world, what we're doing as poets is not necessarily recreating a carbon copy of the experience, right? We are creating art, we're creating an ambiance, we're creating something through the senses that becomes an experience. But the reader, when the reader sees a real authentic experience, or it feels, touches, tastes, etc., they also, in a way, have their own, well, not in a way, they have their own sensory memories, right? So inevitably, what happens when we say we relate to a poem is because the poetess does such a great job of showing you a real experience through the senses that we immediately reflect back on our experiences that might be similar, but it taps onto our own sensory experiences of a particular memory or whatnot. So in a way, the poem also becomes a kind of mirror in which the reader starts seeing their own lives within the life of the poet. And to me, this is part of the magic of art. This is part of the amazing thing, that how art sort of transcends the writer themselves. We often, sorry, make sure I get this right here. All right. Sorry, I'm just fixing some windows here. So yeah, that's why show don't tell is quite important. And we'll talk about how that happens in a letter poem in particular, and the pitfall of or the potential pitfalls of forgetting sensory details when we're writing letter poems. So we'll apply this to today's to the theme of this workshop as well. The only other thing I wanted to go over quickly is this idea of figurative language, or the kinds of languages that we use. So we want to, of course, stray away from abstract telling lines, right? And this is, again, the show don't tell idea. We want language that's based on sensory details. So the beautiful autumn leaves, well, it's kind of like a fuzzy picture, right? What's so beautiful about them, what those abstract words or non-concrete words don't really paint that photo, that picture. Don't let us, it's not the language of experience. When we dive into more literal images or sensory details, something else starts happening. If one were to write the maroon and ochre of autumn, something different is happening, right? The picture comes much more into focus. Suddenly we're experiencing something more deeply, right? And then if you think about those choices of color, right, the details that we choose, say the corollary to all this is that the sensory details that you do choose are creating or instilling in the reader a certain mood, a certain emotion, a certain you're directing the reader in some ways, right, by what you're choosing to describe and how you describe it, right? So maroon and ochre they're not really happy colors, right? They're kind of dull, bland color. I mean, little dark colors, right? Versus, let's say, the ever popular and cliche crimson autumn leaves, right? Or, that's a happy feeling, right? This evokes a different kind of feeling, right? For a more somber feeling. Now, beyond literal, so I would also say I put literal image or literal language there, but really, I don't think, in some ways, I don't think anything is literal in a poem, right? No image is literal because we are manipulating, we are choosing something to evoke something beyond just a color, right? So, but nevertheless, when we jump into figurative language, things like, let's say, autumn like confetti, suddenly something very different happens, right? Like suddenly there's this whole sensibility, or this whole idea of experience that comes in by comparing these two things. And figurative language, as many of you probably know, is also at the heart of poetry. Um, for two reasons. One is the power of it to convey experience, right? And also that power and how condensed it is, right? If we accept that poetry, at the heart of poetry is compression, that at the heart of poetry we're trying to say the most with the least amount of words, kind of like music is. When we use figurative language, something like a simile like this, a whole understanding is created by just using three words, right? And you don't have to describe things endlessly sometimes. So if we think about that little simile, for example, suddenly all the qualities of confetti, right? Our minds are doing this automatically without even having to articulate it. All the qualities of confetti, the colors of it, the paperiness of it, the cheer of it, the also the way that confetti is used to mark occasions, right? Like bon voyages and parties and New Year's parties, that they mark thresholds. All those connotations of confetti are suddenly applied to a way of understanding autumn, right? So again, I just wanted to sort of bear down on that for a little bit, and also sort of dissect what is happening with figurative language. So we have two components to figurative language. One is the vehicle, right? And the other is the tenor. The vehicle is the tangible thing in the world that we're using to understand the tenor, which is the intangible thing in the world. So a very what would be considered now a cliche, but by Robert Burns, my love is like a red, red rose. So the tenor, the vehicle here is a rose, right? The thing that we can experience through the senses, right? So, but it's not just the image of the rose, it's the smell of the rose, it's the texture of the petals, it's the thorns of the rose, everything that a rose feels, tastes, smells, all the senses that involve in the rose nest become a way of understanding, or a new way, or a dimension of understanding what love is in a particular poem. So so keep that in mind. I think a lot of times well, not so much in this group, but sometimes in younger, like undergraduate classes or whatnot, There's always this mistake. I hate using the word metaphor because it sounds like it's supposed to be abstract. You know, the students will be like, but I'm being metaphorical. Like, no, you're being abstract. You're not being metaphorical. You're being cryptic. You're not being metaphorical. Because in some ways, not in some ways, in reality, what figurative language is doing is actually grounding the abstract world in the sensory details. It's actually quite the opposite. You know, metaphor has this connotation. I like to use the word trope better because I think that sort of captures a little bit something different. But yeah, it's figurative language is, in the end of the day, based also on this idea of show don't tell, the idea that sensory details carry are the bridge to understanding the abstract. So yeah, I just wanted to share those things with you, just as a again as a refresher for some of you, and as something to think about for those of you that are newer to writing, and as of course as you write your letter poems. So without further ado, which I hate when people say that, um, by the way, you should have received this packet. It's okay if you don't have it printed out or anything. I'm sharing the whole thing, but you'll have it for yourselves um, for yeah, for future reference. So here's a poem. I forgot the title got cut off here. Oh no, sorry, that's the other one. So this is a poem of mine. Uh, and I share this poem not for shameless self-promotion, but just because two reasons. One is I know what went into writing this poem. I mean, I can open the hood and show you what I was doing without any doubt, right? That's one thing. And the other thing, as they say in poetry business, right, never teach a kind of poem you haven't written. So I have written plenty of letter poems. Is something I actually love, and that's partly why I'm so excited to teach this workshop today, and did one about a year ago as well. So here's a poem, and I'll read it, and then let's maybe, as I read it, maybe think about where there's sensory information or sensory details that are evocative for you, where it what might be the power of some figurative language moments in here too. And then we can drift into whatever conversation we drift into. But this is a bit of an older poem, Sending Palms in a Letter, for Nikki Mustaki. And there are also some things that we'll discuss that's in this poem, that's in other poems that we'll discuss, that are characteristic and I would say almost necessary for the letter poem or the epistolary poem. Sending Palms in a Letter for Nikki Mustaki. I received your letter today. Thanks. Along with the crayon sketches of yourself in the cornfields, there where you are. I think I understand now, from what you wrote and how you drew yourself, with a giant frown in your hands and in the air full of refusal. What it must feel like for you, stranded without bearings, towered by those terrible stalks, feeling the empty weight of that awful Midwest sky, above rows of green husks and golden spears. And you, panicking, looking for a way out, back here to yourself, to the palm trees that you miss. I tried sketching a few of them, hoping to send their fronds fluttering like a line of ballerina arms, brushing at my window and bowing to the wind. Even tried to draw the sea for you, waves erasing footprints, and the tufts of wild grasses keeping the mellow dunes from gusting away. If you leave, don't come back. Keep going. Though I'm not sure any place can complete us or completely ruin us. Some days I feel I've known the palms and sea long enough and want to leave myself. But where? To keep watching corn grow or the palms sway. Our question may not be a matter of where, but of how long we have to do all we want to. Now that we're older, certain of this one life, uncertain of the words we need for even the simplest things. How I miss you, for instance. I'm gonna unpin myself. So let me see if I can do this. So yeah, this is hold on, I'm trying to unpin myself, but I can't. Oh, there you go. So yeah, anybody want to jump in and sort of highlight for us some sensory details that they found so evocative, that they found interesting, or the presence of figurative language? There's a lot of people here, so I'm just gonna just jump in because I can't see everybody when I'm screen sharing.
Brushing at my
Jean?
window.
Yeah. What's that?
Brushing at my window
Right. There's
and
the
bowing to the wind.
right. There's that evocative, right? There's comparing the fronts like ballerinas, but also building on that, right? That imagery, right? So it's but they're brushing on my window and also bowing to the wind, right? So
I can't see the top of the poem, but that the towering corn,
right,
you know, and the diminishing of and the lostness, the towering of those
right, and you can
powerful,
see, I mean, I hope you can
terrible stalks.
right. I hope you can see that purposeful image, right? That using that image to evoke that feeling of displacement, of loss, of yeah, towered by terrible stalks, right? Towered, that image, right? So and the weight of the sky, of the awful Midwest sky, right? All these things are sensory details, right? They're images that are purposely being curated to create that sense of displacement, of ennui, existential angst, and whatnot. What else caught your eye?
I really like the crayon sketches. I mean that's I can see that. I can see the sketches of yourself at the cornfields.
Right. So so this was and this is something we'll talk about in the letter poem in particular, but there's also yeah, we say letter poem, right? But there's also, we want to be creative within the genre of letter poems, right? And so for me, it was interesting. It was inspired because my friend Nikki would send these sketches of herself in the corn, and I thought, what an interesting take, right, on like how to begin a letter, right? This idea of not only words but also images that are being transferred back and forth, and my inability to sketch them, right? My inability to send the image back. It says a lot, but you know, but again, that's something tangible in the world, right? It's like it's like an actual drawing. There's the letter that comes with these drawings, right? Taking the tangible things in the world as a way of using them as metaphor at a sort of at a larger in a larger way, right? What else caught your eye?
I don't think we can talk about the images without the sounds, and you know your sonic evocation.
Right.
You know, the fronds fluttering and brushing and the tufts and all of that gives so much of the multisensorial experience that you're giving.
Yeah, that's right, Margaret. And I think it's also part of the pleasure, but think about it for a second too. That's a sensory detail, right? Why is it that sometimes, you know, we when we hear a poem, especially by the author, we suddenly other sort of a different understanding opens up for us, right? And it's because we're actually now there's more senses being involved. We can hear the poet. We're also seeing the gestures of the poet, for example, or we're also breathing, believe it or not, you know, sort of like we're breathing with those words when we hear them in our ear, just like music, you know, our body is also responding to it physically. So sound is part of what's happening in a poem as a device, the same way as show don't tell. So I'll take, for example, you know, the towering with those terrible stalks, right? That T sound, right? Yeah. That's creating a sound that emphasizes that image even further, right? But when you think about it, are there other like sounds besides the words themselves? Well, we had rustling, brushing at my window as a sound, right? Sometimes and you're right, Margaret, I think we always point out imagery because we're such we're such humans are so much about their eyes, and in poetry we often forget to think about sound and texture, or they're already there, but we're not really noticing them, right? So there's all sorts of all the senses are being evoked in a poem, right? Even I want to say even crayon, I'm thinking I'm smelling crayons, right? Like, right, the smell of the crayons. I'm not only sort of seeing the brushing of the palms at the window, but I'm hearing them, right? And there's also, in a weird way, sound has a texture, right? Like rustling has the kind of a texture, right? I mean, you could you could throw a dart at any of this, and probably every single sense will in some ways be evoked or is implied, right? So maybe just to drive the point home a little bit more. Well, any other observations?
The contrast between the images and the sounds from the first stanza to the second stanza, evokes the mood or the tone. So you've got the awful Midwest sky. I love that. But the K sounds at the start versus the soft fluttering and fronds and the grasses and the softer sounds in the second. Not just they affect the mood, but they also create the contrast in geographical place.
Right. And sort of what Margaret's saying, in a way, like sound creates meaning, right? So like
absolutely.
So but I just to feel like my old Catholic school nuns, but just to drive the point home, that is a sensory detail. It's the heart of poetry, of art, really. That experience that allows us it's not just the image, but the sounds. And we won't get into it, but yeah, the sounds when there's more hard consonant sounds, that creates a different effect. And then the images are content, but fluttering fronds. And then one of my favorite parts of this poem, I don't know why this came to me, but the mellow dunes, right? I was purposely trying to evoke that sensuality of that seascape, of that beachscape, in contrast to, but you're right, the sounds are helping that. It's kind of the chicken or the egg, right? Which came first, the image or the sound? Like we kind of tend to do this instinctually, right? When we've been writing long enough, but thank you for noticing that. Yeah.
Richard, could I say one thing?
Sure, Frank.
I want to acknowledge that stepping back to look at this poem in the way of the world in a thought bubble that you had illustrated. I went into this as an ordinary reader. The sensory details, they're clear. We all understand that feeling palm and corn and all that. I couldn't believe, I was amazed at the turn that the piece took as a whole, where it suddenly went big and it was completely relatable about the fact that it almost doesn't matter where you live. This bigger perspective of what matters is life itself. In other words, I was drawn into a giant conclusion quietly without realizing it. And then that would have been more than enough, but there was I don't want to say punchline, but the last line that then made it so personal, so that the person writing the letter isn't seen as someone who has more power or greatness. They're actually equally vulnerable and human. Right. And so I'm saying the only way to get there is through all those details, because they almost lured us in to relatability. And then it went so big and powerful, I can't get over it still. It was like a quiet explosion. It was beautiful.
Thank you for that, Frank. And that touches on a couple of things. One is, how the structure of the poem, or the movements of the poem, right? And this is a fairly typical and quite effective structure for a poem, right? So you're using all the sensory. It's kind of like I have to show you that experience, right, so that I can conclude something from it, right? So and you can see how the words get more abstract at the end, right? Life, older, that it becomes more abstract thought versus the image. But if I didn't give you the experience and the imagery of all that, you would have been like, okay, but do I buy it or not buy it? So in a way, the sensory details, the experience of the sensory details are creating the proof of what the conclusion is, right? A lot of times when I write a poem, I feel like I'm actually, in a way, I call it like a geometric emotional proof, right? Where one thing has to happen to the next and the next and the next, and slowly the poem draws you in, and there is the typical turn and that kind of closure that you find at the end. But I did want you to notice that experience, that feeling. If this poem would have only been that last stanza without, I mean, theoretically, hypothetically, right? Like if it would have just remained in that abstract world, if I miss you and like come and like, like life sucks, like it doesn't matter where we live. We're not sure of anything. You would have been like, okay, that would have been more telling than showing, right? But you bring up something important too, and I think this is why I actually don't like the rule of show don't tell. Well, I like it, I just don't like the way it's phrased, because two things is we're really telling by showing, right? My choice of these images, my choice of the sound of words is actually, you're curating them to create an effect for the poem and for the reader and for yourself too. But also there are poems, at some point some really good telling is also important in a poem. And like people say like, never tell. Now, granted, when you first start writing, and it's always a pitfall, even if you've been writing for a long time, actually, there should be like 95% showing to 5% telling, but sometimes you need those telling lines, right? That actually are earned, as they say. And I think that's what you're pointing out, Frank. So I will just point out, and that there's probably, I haven't looked at this poem that close, but there's probably maybe a handful of abstract words in here, right? Think about that. The poem is about 95% made up of sensory details, of sensory experience details. Yeah. Anything?
When you talk about the structure and what Frank was just sharing, the image of tried to draw the sea for you, waves erasing footprints, it feels like it's a softer kind of melting away of what you come back to in this bolder way at the end.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
I think the title, yes, sending poems in a letter, the ambiguity of what those poems are meaning when you first enter the poem.
Yeah. So, yeah, Mary, I don't want to discuss, but I think that would be a great segue into diving deeper into letter poems. I think Sally wanted to say something.
I just wanted to say, maybe it's a little off the mark, but sending palms, it feels like either someone you were very close to or an ex-lover or something. And I think of the palms of your hand. I think of you sending touch in some way.
Yes.
Sort of homophonely. I don't know.
Yeah, that's I told you I can let you peek under the hood. That's definitely true. Like I wanted that slight touch of ambiguity that could work both ways. So what we call useful ambiguity in a poem, because it's also extending a hand, right? I'm sending my palm. Like that's the idea of like touching someone's hand, holding someone's hand across space and time. And speaking of, we've talked a lot about sound. Sending palm trees in the letter, also that T, I just didn't like that either. But and I'll just say something, as long as we're sharing so many things about craft, in general, a title is your first line of a poem, right? And we have to think about it that way. But it's also that titles can do many different things, but one of the main things they do is set up context, right? And we'll see that that's very important in a letter poem, especially. So right now it's a letter and I'm sending you, something in the letter. You already know what the occasion of this poem is or what the stance is of the poet. So I want to point one more thing, because how this is also related to figurative language and what Frank was saying about the structure of a poem as a whole. Really, every poem in some ways is a piece of figurative work, right? So in a poem like this, and this is perhaps oversimplifying it, but palm trees, right? And palm trees, the seascape, whatever, that tangible thing in the world, the letter even, right? The drawings of those corn stalks, those are the tangible things in the world. Those are the vehicles with which I am which I am using, right, to discuss the intangible things in the world, the tenors, right? Friendship, displacement, existential crisis, right? Home, right? Questions of home, the abstract word of home, right? The abstract meanings of home and what all that means. So if you think about it's not just the simile that we're working with. Really, poems in themselves are metaphorical constructs. They're conceits, they're tropes. And each one of these little pieces, each one of those little images are in some ways the vehicles that are adding to be able to discuss the abstract and the right? Great. You guys are awesome. So so a few things, and again, please, you seem to be a great bunch, so please interrupt me. Can you see the whole screen? And are the photos of me getting in the way? Let me just. I usually use my big monitor, but then my computer starts freaking out, and might have lost everybody. So now you can see the whole. Yeah. So just want to sort of a way of thinking about what do real letters sort of like have in common with letter poems, right? As a way of thinking about it. What is that? How do we construct that conceit, right? So a couple of things we already saw, right? There has to be this distinct sender and a recipient, right? Like that's the whole construct of a letter poem. And that might seem obvious or just really simpleton, but I guess the corollary is that needs to be known really upfront, right? Like the idea of getting in the middle of a letter poem somewhere like in the fifth stanza, in other words, we have to let the reader in right at the beginning on the conceit that this is a letter poem, right? It's not a letter, but it's a letter poem. And that includes things like a salutation, right? Like there's many different ways of doing that. As we were talking about in my title, right? I actually use the word letter, but sometimes people don't, and but they'll begin the poem with "Dear so and so," or sometimes it's just so letter-like in its stance and in the way that you're seeing that there's two distinct people, one writing to the other. That also sort of constitutes a letter poem. So we'll look at some examples of how different people sort of figure that out. But for me, it was that sending poems in a letter. Okay, here we go for it. I didn't use a salutation per se because I think that was already kind of in the title. What's great about a letter poem, it allows for this incredible intimacy, right? Because you're speaking to someone, and usually it's about something important, and usually it's about something that's urgent. And this kind of goes with what the next piece is, which is an exchange. So there's questions, there's news, there's concern. I didn't put it in here, but I want to call this, right? There has to be a reason for the letter, right? And so in a poem, what I usually call that is kind of like the emotional center of the poem, or the reason for being. For those of you that know French, I don't, raison d'être, right? Like the urgency, the reason for being. And that's something we have to think about. Why am I writing this person, right? It's not just to write. In the poem we just saw, right? It's what was urgent was, this pain that I know my friend is suffering through displacement, right? And I'm reflecting it in my own life. And there is a reason for the letter, right? And sometimes that might take, sometimes that comes to us right away. Sometimes we kind of discover that as we are writing the poem. But that reason for being and that intimacy kind of go hand in hand, right? You know that there's an incredible intimacy between these two people that you just met on that poem, right? What's interesting about also, I think about a letter poem, because the directive of a letter poem really, right, it's that speaking to the other, right? That it can cover a really broad range of subjects and focuses, if you will. So because just like life, when we're speaking about something, there's incredible complexities to it, right? And things that intersect and become part of the conversation with this person that you're having, with this person you're writing to. So if you look again at the poem, right? Yeah, it's about friendship, right? But it's also about estrangement. It's also, like I said, kind of that. I wrote that poem when I was like sort of in my 30s, like sort of mid-30 existential crisis. It's also about belonging. Where do we belong? It's about home. It's about a lot of things, all focus that you get to discuss discreetly and yet very powerfully because of that thread, or that intimacy, that focus of talking to someone. So that's important to think about, or just to acknowledge, just to see. So a dialogue and monologue. So, when we're writing a letter to someone, right? Really think about it. We're writing a letter to ourselves, right? It's a monologue as much as it's sort of an implied dialogue. We're not just writing someone just to, I mean, in the best of most honest letter writing or letter poems, right? There's something else that's going on. This is why these vacuous, like greeting cards and things like that are like, if I hear you're in my thoughts and prayers one more time, I'm just gonna vomit. Like there's no dialogue there, right? There's no monologue even. You're not even really thinking about this. So think about that exploration of the letter poem, and it kind of has to deal with the emotional, right? I'm questioning place and belonging and my place in the world as much as I'm being empathetic with my friend Nikki about those same questions, right? So a letter poem is also ultimately your poem in some ways, right? The other idea is it's and I think a lot of these things apply just to your regular poems, as I'll talk about that later. But the person writing that poem, remember, is still a poet. Is still an artist, right? It's a persona of the self. It's not necessarily, the same way you would write a letter if you weren't thinking about it as a poem, right? So just keep that in mind, right? You're still the poet. You're still the speaker, narrator. You're still adhering to the principles of the craft. So all these things kind of mix and intersect and bend together, and it's fairly obvious when you read a letter poem. But I just wanted to highlight these for you. And I was going to also say that we may be talking about letter poems today, but I think this practicing letter poems is also very useful in the sense that isn't every poem in some ways a letter to yourself, right? In some ways, right? Metaphorically speaking or figuratively speaking, right? We're trying to figure out something for ourselves. We're having a dialogue with ourselves, right? In some ways, or a monologue, as I wrote there. As I think it was Seamus Heaney who said something to the effect of, a poem is nothing but a poet having a conversation with themselves that the reader is overhearing. That's the very important part. So it's not just babbling to yourself. We do that all day while we're driving, while we're in the shower, but it's still that there's a certain practice that letter poems let us understand about how to writing regular poems as well. Any thoughts or questions on this little mini list here? Yeah, Jenna?
Yeah, to me, one of the great strengths of the letter poem is that the reader kind of feels like they're getting in on secrets versus some guru on a mountaintop dispensing wisdom. They're enjoying that intimacy. Really, like Frank was mentioning, that great explosion. It's like you kind of don't know what you're expecting, and then that secret emerges that just makes you gasp a little bit. So it's if you were just the recipient was just the world at large, it wouldn't have the same tone, I think, and the same invitation.
Yeah. And I think, part of what happens in writing any poem, but particularly free verse poems, right, is always trying to find that thread, that parameter of how to how to frame a poem, right? And letter poems are great ways of doing that. But yeah, it's kind of what Seamus Haney was saying. Like it's, you know, it's also overheard by a reader. So this idea of like, that also adds to the sense of intimacy. I'm privileged enough to understand this as a reader, right? This relationship. You also made me think about how wait, it was the idea of overheard. That we also, the vulnerability that comes through when we're writing to someone, right? That it helps us frame that vulnerability, right? And so, yeah, and it's that's part of the great pleasure of reading one and reading a poem, and also a letter poem and writing one. And it's exactly that. Again, I will extend that to, you know, hopefully there are lessons here too, even for our regular poems, right? In a way, we have to do that almost in every poem, right? In some ways, but a letter poem gives us not a formula, but it gives us a mode with which to do that more, perhaps more economically, or perhaps gives us more guideposts to doing exactly what poems should do in the best of circumstances, right? They are allowing the reader in on some emotional essence of what the speaker is discovering, thinking about, or whatnot. Other thoughts on this little mini list? Additions, questions? All right. So this kind of goes, again, this is all intersects and it's all one big mess. But and sometimes, you know, the great things about writing letter poems can also become pitfalls. So going off what Jenna said, one of the dangers of writing a letter poem is that we forget the reader, right? And so we have to be cognizant that someone is overhearing us, right? This is not just for that person. And you have to give them enough context for them to enter that world with you, right? But it's also tricky, right? Because you're also dealing with the conceit of a letter, right? In a letter to my brother, I wouldn't say, for example, you remember our mother, don't you? You know, like, you remember my mother's hair, don't you? Like, so it's weird because you have to sort of give the reader some context, but at the same time, you wouldn't say things that are completely obvious to the recipient, right? So it's that fine line of keeping the reader in mind, but also the conceit, again, of a letter. Again, unlike regular, or I should say, maybe more real letter writing, so to speak, we're not concerned with line breaks. We're not concerned so much with sensory details or all the stuff of poetry, right? So of course that adds a layer that, you know, to understanding that it is a poem, right? And you're using all sensory, you're using musicality we talked about. You're using all those tools in a letter poem while still maintaining that conversational tone. It's not everyday language, but it is conversational. But then again, there's a danger there of just drifting into the ordinary language of ordinary letter writing, right? Which kind of goes to the danger of drifting into where you forget the reader completely. Part of that pitfall is precisely because of the intimacy, right? Like you're writing usually to someone that you know well, right? Or that you have a very strong connection to somehow, or someone you really have to, who knows a lot of what you know, right? And we can, like, that second person address, you, gives you that sense of overhearing, of like great pleasure, of like being privileged to understand that, but at the same time, we can lose context, right? So a lot of times, not a lot of times, but often, I sometimes write a letter poem, but I'll write it in third person, in some ways, to just make sure that, because once you switch person, right, I'm now in charge of telling the story to the reader. And then I play with, you know, or I should say, when I write a letter poem, when I'm contemplating those two things, I'm thinking, is this a letter poem, or do I want to write this in third person, right? How does that work? And what is the fine balance between those things? And then, again, this is part of the craft, right? Of we're not just writing a letter, but trying to find that conceit or that controlling metaphor, or that trope that really binds the poem together, right? So like I just said with with the poems, the seascapes, that's the trope. I'm going to use this landscape and this imagery and the letters themselves, the sketches themselves, as the center trope, as the controlling metaphor with which to discuss all those abstract tenors of life. So yeah. Other thoughts or questions? Observations? There's nothing like diving into the poems, but let's
I have a question.
Sure.
Yeah, so what was I mean I'm not so advanced in my poems, but I haven't spent as much time in writing. I think about the reader, but I don't necessarily think as much about the reading. I mean, I write sonically, and so I know that the words are felt through the sounds, but I don't think about an individual reader and the actual experience, the personal experience of the utterance. You know, I tend to read letters a bit out loud, you know, maybe not the entire thing, but there's something that makes it more intimate to actually bring that voice to my voice.
Right.
And so I wondered if you could speak about that.
Yeah, Margaret, thanks for pointing that out, because I want it, you know, whenever people say the reader, if keeping the reader in mind, you think it's like some, you know, it's really a mindset more than anything. You know, it's not like I'm really conscious of, and neither am I, right? I'm just conscious that I'm making art, that someone else is going to read this, right? That it goes beyond the boundaries of my just talking to myself. And there's different ways that gets delivered, right? One of them is, again, by relying a lot on sensory details, which create an experience that the reader can then, as Frank was saying, can then relate to in some ways, right? But in some ways, I'm writing very much about myself, right? And my own relationship with Mickey, right? So I would, not that I would take that with a grain of salt, but it's really like when people ask me, who's your intended audience? I'm like, anyone that can breathe. You know, like basically it's just that sense that there is someone over your shoulder, right? Or not over your shoulder, that's too intense, but that someone is going to be reading, basically that we're making art, that this is going to convey the essence of me in a very private and a very dramatic way, perhaps, but also it's going to do that with a purpose, which is to connect to another human being in some ways, right? To a reader. So I think there are layers to which different poets consider that, right? There are poets that can be very esoteric and consider the reader less, or I should say less literally, right? And then when you're more of a narrative poet, for example, you sort of consider probably the reader a little more actively, right? You're making me think that in a letter poem, you know, part of the context is if there's a narrative, if there's a backstory, how do we let the reader in on that, right? And I think so I'll say that again, why are letter poems also useful beyond writing letter poems? Exactly for what you asked, Margaret, because I think, you know, in a letter poem, we're really conscious of that, right? Because it's so private, right? We're two people or one person speaking to another. In some ways, we still have to be aware of that, you know, in other poems as well, to a certain degree. Maybe not to this degree, but certainly this teaches that, it makes us practice that, so to speak. I hope that helps. So like, yeah, I don't like to be heavy-handed with the reader. Ultimately, some of my students or workshop participants heard me say this. You know, writing a poem is the stupid, most arrogant, selfish, self-absorbed, dumbest things you could do in the world, right? And what I mean by that is that it has to begin with the self. It has to begin with a kind of urgency that I'm going to make art out of my life somehow, right? And by the same token, writing a poem is one of the most selfless, generous, gregarious things you can do, because you realize when you go through that journey in a poem that the reader is also going to connect, and it's a gift in a way. And as they say, once we finish a poem, it's no longer ours, but that the poem does something in the world as a piece of art. So it's kind of a little bit contradictory, but I think a poem needs to begin in some ways not considering the reader, right? Because in some ways, the beginning of a poem is really an exploration of what the hell am I feeling? Like, what is this confusion? Like, and making the art is what helps us navigate and guides us through what it is that this experience or this memory was about ultimately. But that's also a gift to the reader because they're with you, right? And they're with you simply, I think, to put it even more plainly, they're with you simply because the art itself, the way that a poem is crafted, right? The precepts of those craft techniques do that, right? Just using sensory details do that. Whether you are consciously, oh my God, I'm going to put this in here because the reader's gonna, gonna love this. Like I'm actually loving it. I'm like, okay, like this is cool. I just found a way. I found a way to solve this sonically, and found this image that I think is fresh and really gets to the core of the emotion, right? Like really represents it. So when you're paying attention to your art, you're also in a way indirectly paying attention to the reader, if that makes sense. Right? All right, let's little 5-minute break. We'll back at 11:05, and then we'll dive into reading some letter poems, and then, like I said, we'll do some warm-up or startup exercises, and hopefully we'll have a little time to share, or at least share the experience of be going or answer any questions for the group as a whole. So yeah, five after everyone. Getting a little more Cuban coffee. All right, we're back. Dear poetry participants, workshop participants. Start this share again. All right. So a couple of things that I was thinking on the break. Few things. One is, a letter poem, like any challenge of writing any poem, what we're trying to find is some kind of conceit, right? Some kind of parameter. This is a great option, right? Sometimes I'm like, oh, yes, this would be great as a letter poem. So you always keep that in your tool bag, so to speak. In the same way that there's different modes, like for example, a personification poem, oh, let me solve this by writing in the voice of a dog, right? Or a persona poem. Let me write a poem that's in the voice of someone else, right? So there's different, like an ekphrastic poem, writing a poem about a painting, right? So there are all different modes that help us to sort of focus a poem, help us to get us through the writing of a poem, through the blank page. And what you'll see later on in some of the examples at the very end is that a lot of these things also, they get very creative and they start intersecting kinds of modes. And it's not always a letter to like a mom or a family member or friend. Sometimes it's a letter. There's one poem in here in your packet that's a letter to someone, I think, 100 years from now, right? It's a way of discussing something, topic by this imaginary recipient of this letter. There are some poems in here. There's one poem that's letter to the editor, right? Which is just to have a go at like American poetry. There's all sorts of interesting ways that you can use the letter in a different way that's not just strictly what we're thinking about today. The reason I chose examples that were more person to person was thinking about the epistolary main project, which is going to be pen pals. So you're going to be writing to a person, but letter poems can be used to discuss everything from climate change to it's just always something to keep in mind as a way of an interesting, creative way to approach a subject, right? And at least and frame it. So keeping all these conversations we've had in mind from let's look at a couple of poems, and we can refer back to those things we learned already. We can also explore new things that you're observing. Zoom that up a little bit. So this is a poem by Natasha Trethewey. Sorry, let me fix that here. Natasha Trethewey is one of my favorite poets in the world. Hold on. She, for those of you that might not know, she was our U.S. Poet Laureate a few years ago, several years ago, I think. I've lost my Zoom here. Sorry, guys. Let me stop share a second. Do that again. I lost your faces for some reason. So this is the one that hold on. Sorry, all. Let's see your faces. I lost your face. Oh God, I've become my parents. It's like that Geico commercial.
Go to do you see the little thing at the top where you can change the view, Richard?
Yeah, no, I just lost completely like the panel. Oh.
Go up to the little thing at the top, you can change the view. Get out of screen share, it's easier to see.
Okay. Speaker. Gallery.
There you go.
All right, so there we go. Got it. All right, so here we go. Natasha Trethewey, U.S. Poet Laureate. I had cut off the title, but it's called Letter Home. So you might want to fill that in. Again, immediate context, right? Letter home. Like this is a letter poem, and it's going to have to deal with issues of home, place, identity, etc. So let's read that. And New Orleans, another great thing. Context, right? Place and date, right? So if you look at this, right, Natasha Trethewey is not that old. So it's just a little marker that you could miss right away, right? But it adds to it's another layer in this poem, which is in the voice of someone, which I believe is probably a mother or grandmother writing of some kind of family history, right? Did someone say something? I'm sorry. Hey, Dina. 4 weeks have passed since I left, and still I must write to you of no work. I've worn down the soles and walked through the tightness of my new shoes, calling upon the merchants, their offices bustling. All the while, I keep thinking my plain English and good writing would secure for me some modest position, though I dress each day in my best, hands covered with the lace gloves you crocheted. No one needs a girl. Now flat, how flat the word sounds, and heavy. My purse thins. I spend foolishly to make an appearance of quiet industry, to mask the desperation that tightens my throat. Just love that, right? Desperation, the abstract thing, right? Tightening the throat, the thing that the vehicle, the thing tangible that we're feeling in the world. I sit watching, though I pretend not to notice, the dark maids ambling by with their white charges. Do I deceive anyone? Were they to see my hands, brown as your dear face, they'd know I'm not quite what I pretend to be. I walk these streets, a white woman, or so I think, until I catch the eyes of some stranger upon me, and I must lower mine, a negress again. There are enough things here to remind me who I am. Mules lumbering through the crowded streets, and me in reverie. Their footfall, the sound of a pointer and chalk hitting the blackboard at school, only louder. Then there are women clicking their tongues in conversation, carrying their loads on their heads, their dusky voices, the washpots and irons of the laundresses call to me. I thought not to do the work I once did, backbending and domestic, my schooling a gift. Even those half days at picking time, listening to Miss J, how I'd come to know words, the recitations I practiced to sound like her, lilting, my sentences curling up or trailing off at the ends. I read my books until I nearly broke their spines, and in the cotton field, I repeated whole sections I'd learned by heart, spelling each word in my head to make a picture I could see, as well as a weight I could feel in my mouth. So now, even as I write this and think of you at home, goodbye is a waving map of your palm, is a stone on my tongue. So a couple things there, I'll just start to a couple things that this letter poem sort of helps us frame. Remember, we talked about how it can cover a lot of ground, right? So there's so many things being discussed here, right? There's a sense of not misogyny, but of course, male chauvinism or whatnot, woman's place in the world, 1910. There's issues of race being discussed here, right? There's socioeconomic class being discussed here. There's colorism being discussed here. There's so much being discussed here that the form itself allows, right? It can skip very economically from one thing to another, blend into one thing into another. So notice that. The other thing, again, how interesting as a way of discussing, which is sometimes what a poem can do at its best, right? It's a way of telling family history in a way that is not like, oh, and my grandmother did this. Like, no, let the grandmother or the mother speak, right? Let them put yourself in their emotional shoes. And the letter poem allows for that in some ways. It gives us some structure and some frame for it. So this is not only a letter poem, but also a personification or a persona poem. So anything you like or anything you observe about the form here that you want to share with us? Or about the poem as a whole? Notice all the sensory details.
I noticed just by saying the lace gloves you crocheted, she gives the background of her mother, you know, it really pulls that right in there. And it's not much, but it's just you and brings her in.
Yeah, it's interesting, right? And that's a tangible detail, right? Lace gloves. But look how much that lets us know, right? First of all, the fact that they're crocheting their own gloves, right? That gives you some socioeconomic class. They're not just buying them at some fancy store, right? The care of crocheting gloves is crochet, like, you know, like it's a handmade thing. That obviously but she's writing to another female, right? Unless the dad crochets in 1910, which I don't think that's going to be possible, right? So yeah, and just and then she follows it. No one needs a girl, right? Like sort of this idea of, and we don't know exactly if this might be writing to a grandmother or a mother, but definitely there's another female figure in the family that's safely, yeah. So yeah, that little detail says so much.
Yeah, you wouldn't crochet gloves for just anybody. You've gotta love them, you know.
And the beauty of that, right? Like beautiful, like how beautiful, right? What a special, thing. And then this tangible memory that she has of the beloved. Anne, you wanted to say something?
Yeah, thank you. So I really loved that quick little sentence, "My purse thins." It's vivid, and I really like that a lot. And the other thing I really wanted to say is that so much of this is about words. The whole, so her riches are her erudition, her ability to use language. That's what she thinks she has to earn a living on, and it's completely unrecognized. And then at the very end, when the word becomes a stone on her tongue, I really love that image.
Yeah, it comes down. So that's another big topic discovering, right? Language itself, right? And also the intersection of language with this idea that language. Natasha's obviously New Orleans, right? So like, there's also this idea of the Southern drawl, right? So like you go, the idea of losing that accent, which is very much part of the self and identity, and what trouble she went through, thinking that language and being educated, we're gonna pursue these things. So the poem is also about disillusionment in a way too, right? Again, I just wanted to in the letter poem how it can accommodate all that. So much is going on, right? You could write a poem just about language, right? Just about that little moment about being in the school, right? But this, again, the form allows us to really just connect so many dots, because that's what we do when we write letters, right? We're not writing just one little, there's a lot we usually want to talk about, and we start making the connections, right? Okay, Susan, you want to say, and then Erica?
Yeah, I just remembered being the first time I saw this poem, I think it was in a previous workshop with you. I was just blown away that at the very top, just New Orleans, November 1910. Right. The fact that she put it in that time, that, yeah, I know she's putting it in the voice of her mother, but that struck me, just that choice. It focused the whole poome for me. Yeah, it got me emotional right away.
It gives you immediate context. It's like, it's almost like a movie where like, November 1910, right? The poem still has to do a lot of work, but I want you to notice too, that the language that she's using also, right? feels a bit more of that time, right? Like nobody needs a girl, you know, that's the language back then. Even using the word negress, right? That's probably a word you would not use in a contemporary poem, right? But because of the conceit of that 1910 of putting this in a specific time, yeah, it's almost like a little time machine, right? We just go into that. And then New Orleans too, right? So again, this is part of what a letter poem should do, to create that conceit right up front, to let you know where, and that context for the reader can just jump in. And then I also want to talk a lot about, you know, one of the most important things in a letter poem or any poem, but the reason for writing, right, has to be sort of really upfront, the emotional center for being, right? 4 weeks have passed since I left, and I must write you of no work. Boom. We know what the struggle is. We know they've been apart for 4 weeks. And then she continues and continues, but you know right up front the reason for being of this letter, right? There's an urgency that comes up right up front. Right. Erica, and then Rosalind.
As we're talking about these letter poems too, there's something, it's almost a little meta to me, like like being a narrator, being a person who writes letters, and why we write letters, and maybe the loneliness of the existence of day-to-day interaction, and the desire for like a deeper connection is maybe in us becoming pen pals or letter writers. So there's something that like makes the narrator of these poems have I instantly feel more deeply involved or invested than just a poem saying, I'm looking out at the blah, blah, like who, does that make sense?
Oh yeah, certainly. Yeah, that's a great observation or point, like the idea of it being meta, right? So like it's writing about writing, right? In a way, I don't know if we've all heard the term ars poetica, which is another kind of mode, which is a poem about a poem, or about writing about a poem, about the creative process in some way, shape, or form, about the creation of a poem, about what poetry is. And so that's very meta, but this has definitely a meta quality, because we are aware that we're using the art form of writing itself as a way of creating the poem, right? So it's peeking under the hood. Yeah. Rosalind, you wanted to say? Oh, you're muted.
There you go. One observation, or I guess kind of question that I had, is you had talked about in epistolary writing, conversational but not everyday language. But there are two things that really strike me in this poem, and one is sometimes the plainness of the language is sort of against some of the imagery, has a real punch to it. Like the first line, for instance, is almost prosaic. It's just bam. 4 weeks have passed since I left, and still I must write you of no work is very conversational. And then you get the tightness of the new shoes. So I found that kind of, I don't know if that balance was pretty cool.
Right. Yeah.
And also just something that I'm often guilty of is, sometimes one adjective does way more than like 6. So things like just new shoes. I mean, it's simple, but it's all it needs is that one word.
Yeah, you're right. And and that's something we're particularly paying attention to in the letter poem, because on the one hand, it has to feel like a letter, right? And in a letter, you wouldn't begin with these fancy, and yet it's not, right? So it is very prosaic. I sit down to write. That's correct. I wore down the soles. Notice that's not typical language, right? Mm-hmm. And walked through the tightness of my shoes. That's not something you would, even though it's very conversational, but it is manipulating language in a way that heightens its poetic value, right? Even the word, keep thinking of plain English of good writing, security, and modest, though I dress each day in my past, hands covered with I'm trying to think where the purse things that someone pointed out. That's personification, right? You wouldn't necessarily say that in a real letter, right? My purse thins, right? Very good point. Yeah. And it's always finding that balance of being believable, but also understanding that it's a conceit. And the fine line is the pleasure that the reader gets out. How can you construct this, right? Elizabeth?
Good morning. My synapses are catching up 3 hours behind you. So thank you for this amazing workshop. The Natasha Trethewey, I was just telling a friend, like the one time I got to meet her and didn't know who she was. And I wish I still had that book because it smelled like her. I remember coming back from that first workshop going, oh, Natasha Trethewey. Sorry, that was an added unnecessary factoid. Masking, that word to mask was what really caught me in the first stanza. And the use of compression. I'm coming back to writing after many years of writing for other people in very boring ways. and the whole concept of unmasking, like and she used it as a verb, but it's also the mask we wear. Like, I don't know.
Yeah.
Synapses are starting to fire, like how relatable this is now. You know, me as a reader coming to this, but also how do I do this in my own life now with masking my disabilities, masking chronic illness? How do I come back to the poem and unmask without trying to sound pretentious at the same time? You know, how do I stay away from that and the art of restraint, but also the tone? I don't know. There's a lot there, but
yeah,
I just wanted to speak up and participate because I have been away from this for so long. So thank you for letting me rip the Band-Aid off.
Yet another layer again of how much a letter poem can discuss, right? Yet another layer of complexity and emotional intersections with all these things. You did make me think about something else that was about language and asking, but when you're talking about, it's still relevant today, right? And so part of what this poem, I think, is also why a letter poem can be effective versus, I know people have said here and there, like, it's not just a talking head, someone talking to the world, right? Now we have social political issues, or several, in race and whatnot, grounded in a real life, in two people's real lives, right? And that's the power of poetry in general, that it grounds it in it. Poetry bears witness in that way, right? It's real people's lives that are not just abstract doings or conversations. So we only have time to do one more. So I will speak about let's do Marie House. Marie House, also one of my favorite. Now here's a poem that's not, does it say it's a letter? Does it say the date? New Orleans, 1910, but it has the letter mode. And I think that sometimes those are choices, but it's very much a directed poem, right? It even begins, Johnny. So we know that's the way she solved it in this poem, right? I'm not going to write letter. It's clearly obvious. Johnny, the kitchen sink has been clogged for days. Some utensil probably fell down there. And the Drano won't work, but smells dangerous. And the crusty dishes of dangerous is such a purposeful word. And the crusty dishes have piled up. Notice the crusty dishes, right? Sounds conversational, like we're pointing out, but it's not the stuff of everyday language. Again, part of the challenge of a letter poem. Crusty dishes have piled up waiting for the plumber. I still haven't called. This is the everyday we spoke of. This isn't about Drano. This isn't about crusty dishes. Here is the center of emotion of the poem. Like, now we're going to dive into it, right? This is the everyday we spoke of. It's winter again. The sky a deep, headstrong blue, and the sunlight pours through the open living room windows because the heat's on too high in here, and I can't turn it off. That's loaded, right? And I can't turn it off. Every word is manipulated in a poem, right? And yet it sounds like a letter. For weeks now, driving or dropping a bag of groceries in the street, the bag breaking, I've been thinking, this is what the living do. And yesterday, hurrying along those wobbly bricks in the Cambridge sidewalk, spilling my coffee down my wrist and sleeve, I thought it again and again later when buying a hairbrush. This is it. Parking, slamming the car door shut in the cold. What you called that yearning. What you finally gave up. We want the spring to come and the winter to pass. We want whoever to call or not call, a letter, hint, hint, a kiss. We want more and more than more of it. But there are moments, walking, when I catch a glimpse of myself in the window glass, say, the window of the corner video store, and I am gripped by a cherishing so deep for my own blowing hair, chapped face, and unbuttoned coat, that I'm speechless. I am living. I remember you. This is what the living do. Very simple words, right? Yeah, exactly, Erica. I'm like, I just lose it. Like, this is what the living do. And you're like, okay, I'm gonna lose it now. You saw me pause on that, right? But besides the magic of what a poem can do, in some ways, this is also another kind of intersection with elegy, right? There is not the exact meaning, but we can infer that this is someone who has passed, right? By you finally gave up. I am living and I remember you. So there's that intersection of it too. Yeah, thoughts? Good, Susan.
I love this poem. I am always dealing with when I'm working on a poem, and I'm wondering if you can speak to this. What is the poem when you hear it read by somebody and you do not see the print in front of you? And what is the poem when you are just reading it from the page yourself? I mean, I could, this poem to me was an example of something where I could close my eyes, hear you read it, not see the words myself, and not miss a beat. And that is kind of brilliant. And I think about those things sometimes when I'm creating poems. Do they only exist? Do they exist the best on the page when someone can see the words too? Or can it exist on its own without the audience seeing those words while you read?
I think it depends from poem to poem. I think it also depends on your style, and what kind of poetry you consider yourself, what kind of poet. I will say before I forget that obviously a lot of the letter poems, because of the conversational, intimate tone, definitely you don't even need the page, right? Like it's kind of like, because that's the parameter of a letter poem. So again, that fine line between something so conversational that you don't need to see the words, right? And yet it's still poetry. That's one thing. I think there are poems, I know myself, there are poems that when I do readings, there are poems with mine that are a little more esoteric, a little more harder to just take in through the ear. And I think those poems are necessary too. I don't think that these things are mutually exclusive, but it's good to be aware of that, right? And it's also thinking about what kind of poem. Like I personally like to write more accessible poems that you could probably listen through the ear without having the page. I will say also that I don't think accessibility and complexity are antonyms, right? In my personal purview of poetry, as Gwendolyn Brooks said, poetry is life distilled. But that's my aesthetic, right? We also create our own aesthetic. And it's not that one poem is better than the other. They're just different. There are some very dense, esoteric poems that I love, but I do need the page. And so also if you're reading, you have to make those choices, right? I know there are certain poems when I do a reading that are going to be more audience friendly versus some of the the more that you need to sit with them a little. But I think they all give us something that's worthwhile in portrait. Again, it's like music, you know, it's like, hey, I'm in the mood for like Beethoven today, right? Or I'm in the mood for Dua Lipa, you know, or I'm in the mood for James Taylor, right? So those things are all, I think, work. Right. I'll just talk about this one, and this is one of my favorite poems ever. It's from a piece of a larger poem. And then we'll do the exercises. I won't read it in the interest of time, but so I just want you to notice as you read this poem, again, it's not technically, it doesn't call itself out as a letter poem, but it's such a direct address, right? And so what's interesting here, and someone mentioned the meta, right? So here's kind of a poem letter, not a letter poem, where like I'm sending you a poem, like I want to send it sketches of the poems, like I know you are reading this poem. You're like, okay, you is no longer, okay, I'm in, like, so that power of direct address, you know, we become the you as well, right? In a letter poem, we start becoming the recipient. Anyway, what I want you to, when you read this poem, how interesting, how instead of describing her landscape, her setting, she dives into the imagined spaces, or not even imagined, the spaces that maybe they've shared together. So here, the author, the poet, puts themselves in, almost in the body of the recipient. I know you're reading this poem before leaving your office of the one intense yellow lamp spot in the darkening window and the lassitude of a building faded to quiet long before rush hour. There's this omniscient power that's really interesting. Again, another way to skin the letter poem, so to speak. So I've tried to copy that poem. This one by Elizabeth Bishop is a little more straightforward. Again, letter to New York. But what I find interesting about this, it's kind of like she's pissed off. And it's the letter about telling someone, you better write me, asshole. Yeah. Like, I want to hear what's going on. Where are you? Like, so that's an emotion too, right? Like the estrangement. Like, and she also imagines herself like, what are you doing here? You know, the cab rides, are you here? What is going on? Why haven't I heard from you? She's a little peeved. I won't say angry, but that's another interesting take. So let's do this. I'm gonna put here. And you don't have to like stick to like the 2 minutes, but this is sort of all goes together. The first thing is I just want you to think about like the last time you received a letter, or a letter that you really remember. What was that feeling like, right? Or the last time you wrote a letter too, right? A real letter, you know, like something where you actually sat down and it wasn't just a birthday card. Hey, happy birthday, you know. Just to get into that mindset, really, you know, just to mine your own experiences of what letters have been in your life for a minute and set that tone in your head, an emotional tone. And then maybe think about sorry, I got a little skipped into here, copy and pasted wrong. Motivations, like list like reasons for writing someone. Try to think about 10 people and 10 people that you have something to tell them, right? And then take 10 minutes and just jot down some quick fodder, right? Like some stuff to think about how you you know, like almost like free writing, fever writing, whatever you want to call it. And then maybe take a stab at the first line or two, right? It's like, I know you're reading this poem. Just start the poem, everyone, right? And then we'll reconvene about 10 of or so. Sorry, this has been such a great group and time flies, as they say. But for those of us that can stay a little longer, I'm willing to do so if we want to share also what happened, you know, in these small exercises. All right, so we'll see at 10 of. Is that good? And if you need to take a little longer, go ahead and we'll just sort of mosey our way into the group. Sorry, I realized I stopped the sharing. I don't know what to do. All right. Start making our way back. I feel like I'm always bringing people out of a meditation. So I think, like I said, we might stay a bit longer, but up to voluntary kind of whatever you like to do, sharing or just a roadblock you hit, or what you're thinking about, or what you discovered. I think we're all learning from each other too. So you're sharing what you just landed on in this last 10 minutes is also helpful to all of us as we think about our letter poems. And I'm not sure how many of you are going to participate. I hope you all do in the main Pen Pal epistolary poem project. But again, these are lessons for you to take for any time you want to write a letter poem, and any poem at all, really. Any aha moments?
Well, I'll say an aha moment, and I'm not being funny, but it's that I used to be a giant letter writer back in the 80s, 70s, 80s. And basically, like, if you want to just take the last 6 months, I don't get letters, I only write them. And so this exercise was like a little slap to remind me about that reality. So I'm just sharing that as an opening thing.
Well, that's like Elizabeth Bishop's poem, right? Just like, write to me.
Yeah. Yep.
It is interesting, like how also just the paper trail, like I'm looking at my archives, how before email, right? You actually, even in my own lifetime, like how the paper trail just dies.
Yeah.
And I still take great, care that's why it takes me forever to do emails, because I'm still like of the old school, like I'm not just gonna blurt something out. I write emails with the thesaurus. Anyway, but that could be an interesting take, Frank, for a poem, of some kind, like meta, right? So here's a letter to you about writing letters that you never write, like, and or a letter to a letter. There's all sorts, like later on in the packet, you'll see there's all sorts of really interesting, creative ways in which people interpret a letter poem. So can keep on thinking about that. Jean, you're muted though, and then Dina.
Okay, I seem to keep coming up with names of people that I need to apologize to. I got started with that and I couldn't stop. I can't think of any other reason to write a letter right now.
Well, that's interesting. I don't right. So that's a great, so you've hit on some kind of sort of emotional core of what that letter might be about, right?
Yeah,
and I think as you write it, as we write poems, as we write letters, of course, we discover new things, and that guilt might turn into like, yeah, you dirty rat, it was your fault. So go with that if that feels really strong in you, like that's an interesting again, like a built-in already emotional reason for being, right?
Yeah.
Dina, you were gonna say?
Oh, empathy letters. I've gotten some and I'm sending some, but mostly because of the war in Israel and its effect on all my people around the world, and including Portland, Maine, and the streets here. And I'm scared. And the friends in Israel, I can't reach. And in Florida and Carolina, finally being able to connect with all but two. But those two, I can't get out of my mind. I can't. And Chimney Rocks, all the places I've been in, and the people I know, it's the emotions are almost too much, but I find myself writing because of it.
Right, so that's interesting too, right? Another take on the letter poem. So it could be a letter to someone you don't know, right? Or it could be, for example, letter to a girl, maybe a photo you saw in a newspaper, right? So it becomes an interesting way to sort of ground what is a big emotional, but also social political issue, and bring some intimacy, even if it's someone you don't know, right? So That might be and there are some examples of that, again, creative examples of people, how they skin the letter poem, but again, I think it'll give you a way to have this conversation with yourself, right? And then with the world at large, by just that stance, right? Like it helps us to cover that ground. It helps us to intimatize, if that's a word, to what is a larger, more abstract issue, right? To make it more intimate, by exercising the imagination. Great. Those are cool. Tammy?
Hi. I had kind of a cathartic experience I wasn't planning to have with the exercise. And it makes me realize that a great use of the letter poem might be having these conversations that are actually impossible to have with the recipient. My daughter was married a few weeks ago and chose not to invite my father, which I understood and totally respected. But these are the first lines that came out in my exercise. Dear Dad, it is with great pleasure that I announce that Grace was married recently to a wonderful young man we all love. I don't know if you would, your love having always been bewildering. Please know the wedding was small, intimate, just a civil celebration of love under a warm September sun. Nothing bewildering, but everything beautiful.
That is so white, that intimacy, right? Excellent. I mean, and we have the reason for the letter right away, right? There's also something interesting in the language that you're crafting, right? It feels very respectful, right? In the ways that perhaps one would write to a parent, right? But it's also sort of easing him into the news, right? It's got a very particular tone that's coming through. And in a way, it's an interest. Someone was saying about apologizing, right? It's almost like an apology, a secondhand apology, right? So that's an interesting, very particular and specific and interesting stance for that letter poem. Yeah, thank you I'm glad you're having a cathartic moment, because I think this is part of what letter poems do. And in the end, if you drop the conceit of a letter, that's fine too. But just the idea of writing in second person is such a big choice in writing poetry versus third person, or the idea that you're writing to someone in particular already sets us in a mode, right? That often, again, the pitfalls are all the things we talked about. We can just lose ourselves in that conversation and forget that we're also making art. But the art is also what's going to make us discover new things. So I often sometimes I will play with writing for second or third person, because I think it's important. What things happen in a poem that wouldn't, the pluses and the minuses of those persons, right? Of writing in second or third. But yeah, I'm glad you're having that cathartic moment in a way that's hopefully enriching and not,
Thank you.
Yeah, Erica?
I liked the part of the exercise with the list. So, I instantly knew who I wanted to write to, but then the fact to try to come up with 10 people, like it was really fun and expansive. And so, it just kind of went like to Oj about his drinking and my disappointment, to Sadie about letting her go. But then I was like kind of stuck. And then I wrote to Amy from the Indigo Girls about fan letters I wrote in the high school and what it felt like when she answered them, and it kind of expanded to Laurie, who has tanked her life. And she was the first who seemed like she made it when she guest starred on Friends, but now she walks dogs and takes too many pills for chronic back pain. Like it started to grow into these images just from a list. And that reminded me how useful that is.
Well, I think what's interesting there in terms of process, and this is also maybe analogous or akin to even when we start just a poem, right? Part of the process of writing a poem is you keep on digging deeper and deeper, and you're discovering something. What you walk into a poem with is not often where you end up, right? And hopefully not, because that makes the writing, first of all, and to discover something for yourself, and that the reader enjoys that discovery as well, right? Sees the emotional evolution within 20 lines of a poem. And I think part of the exercise is you have the people you immediately think I want to write, and then all these other things come that actually Yeah, I think I want to write about the Indigo Girls, right? It's, when we come to a poem, a lot of times it's just, eschewing or exorcising the expected reaction, right? Often when I free write, for the same reason I do that, is like to go beyond the expected. What I think what I'm convinced of is my emotion, right? And often those poems that I don't let that go or don't go anywhere. So that's a great sort of kind of what's happening there. Yeah. Anybody want to share? Anybody hit any roadblocks? There's some very good news. I love this, but well, anything else you want to share? You don't have to read the lines, but thank you for sharing that, Tammy.
I can share just the letter that came to me. I won't read it, but my grandmother is so much a part of my getting through everything in my life and the loves in my life, and I have her paintings around me, and she sang and played ukulele, and all of that stuff is with me always. But I have a letter that my sister saved because she's our archivist, of my grandmother writing me and not knowing where I was. And so it's a letter that's in an envelope with my name on it and a question mark where the address would be. So this letter is writing to that.
So you're going to respond. That's another interest, right? Responding to a letter that you never responded to, right? And again, I think what we're seeing here is that you want to find an interesting way into, I mean, yeah, you can write a straight up letter poem, but also the more, if there's something, an interesting or creative dimension in which you sort of create this poem, that makes it all the more powerful. And that's, I was going to say earlier, also there could be a letter that you never sent, right? It's funny because I was just thinking about this, Margaret. I created a letter poem based on letters I found that my mother's sister sent from Cuba. And then I used excerpts of the letter and then like interjected my own thoughts. And then my mother's reply to her sister, which I realized was a letter she never sent because it was there, unless she made a carbon copy back then. But that's all interesting complexities, or let's say complexities, but like sort of like interesting ways to mess with the letter form, right? To good end.
Like Ocean Vuong's letter to his mother that she'll never read. No, do you know that one?
No, no.
Ocean Vuong's letter to his mother that she'll never read.
Oh, yeah.
She didn't speak English, and it also contained things that he wouldn't have said to her if she could have read. It's very powerful.
Yeah, that's another take. Yeah, I love the form, and there's also so many. I once wrote there's also fictional letters, right? So you can like kind of like Natasha's poem, right? Like, so like you get to also, and that was very personal, but I sometimes discuss there's one particular poem that's in the voice of a woman addressing her father, which is a very, very risky thing to do. But I think it allowed me to talk about something that I wouldn't ordinarily have the authority to do so, or that I would be called out on, right? Especially in today's time, our times today, where there's a lot of sensitivity around those things, right? So sometimes it allows you to discuss something in ways that you don't always own, but become plausible because of the form itself, and then because of the creativity and the imagination at work. Nobody had any roadblocks. I love it. Well, I'll say couple more things. If you look on, I believe, I was going to check before, but I believe if you look on the Academy of American Poets website, you can search for letter poems as a kind of poem. So if you want more examples, you can probably just type it in on the internet. There's probably dozens of more than dozens of examples. It is something that poets do practice very much. Again, one of the modes we look for to solve a poem in a particular context. And let's just say one more. No, I think that was it. Yeah, and so you all have the packet, I hope, so you can refer to it. What do you say if we end on just reading one more poem and letting that stay in the air? Anybody was able to peruse the packet and has a poem they'd like us to read?
Could you repeat the name of that website for me?
Oh, it's just the Academy of American Poets.
Oh, thank you. By the way, this is wonderful.
Oh, thank you. I'm thinking, and so yeah, did anyone? No, I'll just pick one and then let's pick a weird one. That was too long and too white male. Let me see. See, there's a cool one. Letter to someone living 50 years from now. Okay, so here's just to make it short, but so think about letters, but also think about other forms of written communication, right? That are still in the same kind of mode, right? I've written postcard poems, and I actually make it look like a postcard. Of course, they have to be very small. You could write an email, right? You could write a Facebook post as that could be, in a way, it's still a letter mode, right? You're talking to someone, right? So and then this is something. It's Notepass to Superman by Lucille Clifton. Such a Lucille Clifton. Sweet Jesus, Superman. If I had seen you dressed in your blue suit, I would have known you. Maybe I would have known you. Maybe that court. Why is all these things coming up? I don't know. Maybe that choir boy Clark can stand around listening to stories, but not you, not with Metropolis to save and every crook in town filthy with kryptonite. Lord, man of steel, I understand the cape, the leggings, the whole ball of wax. You can trust me. There is no planet stranger than the one I'm from. Like, right? So very, very whimsical, but very poignant, right? But also the idea of writing to someone who doesn't even exist. That's a fictional character, right? You can write a letter to Clark Gable or to, in my case, to Ryan Gosling. No. Well, no, he exists. Sorry, to the character in the Notebook. So isn't that cool? So there's still a social commentary, right? But it's the letter mode. It's a short little note to Superman. By the way, former participants or students, or however you want to call yourselves, you all know that my favorite movie is The Notebook. And I got to discuss The Notebook at this film at the University of Miami Film School, where they do a really interesting program where everybody watches a film and they invite an interlocutor to talk about why this is your favorite film, et cetera, and about films in general. And so, and there I was like a baby still crying and sobbing. Even though that's like the 12th time that I've watched it. Ironically, I've never seen it on the big screen. So it was really interesting. And anyway, it's just a little inside Blanco gossip. But anyway, any other last thoughts, questions, concerns?
Question.
Sure.
Richard, where do we find where do we find your Ryan Gosling poem?
Oh, I haven't written it yet.
Oh. Get on that. I want to read it.
Now I have to deal with that Barbie movie. That was a great movie though, but I was like, no. I want him in The Notebook. But yeah, just different possibilities. Like, have fun with it. I mean, I think the project is different, and that's fine. I plan to participate in the project, so you know, that there's another cool, and this is sort of in a way similar. I mean, I don't know all the details of the epistolary project exactly, but there's I don't know what you call it, an organization or something. It's called There's a Poem in That. And what the founder or whatever the director does, he pairs you with somebody that you don't know at all, and he interviews them on just an audio, and you just listen to their story, and then I write a poem in response to his story. And then there's like this big reveal where I read the poem to him, and like it's just, we were crying, like it was just like, and I feel like there's going to be something similar here of like really getting to know another human being in a way that through art, right? Which is a beautiful way to do that. So again, I'm looking forward to seeing how that's all going to work. I think it'll work beautifully. But yeah, so I guess we did what we did get. All right, everyone, good luck. And
Thank you.
Thanks for joining us. And
This has been wonderful. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah, thank you.
Thank you, Richard.
yeah, writing.
Thank you.
Bye.
Beautiful.
Bye.
Thanks.
You can also write a letter to yourself, by the way.